Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Delgado. I am the president of Castle Group. We are a large property management firm that serves throughout the state of Florida. And in addition to being the property management rep on this particular webinar, I also have a background in high-rise tower design and construction. Alan?
I'm Alan Tannenbaum, Scrow, Lamole, and Kleinberg. Our firm has got construction lawyers, primarily serving the community association field. We do defect cases on buildings coming through turnover, and we also consult with associations on major repair projects, prepare their contracts, negotiate them, and assist during the progress of the projects. Our offices are in Fort Myers, Sarasota, Clearwater, and Orlando.
Fantastic. Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Tom?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Tom Conricode with Forge Engineering. I'm a principal engineer with Forge. Forge is a 25-year-old company that specializes in forensic engineering. We do work with a lot of associations, high-rise properties, low-rise properties across the gamut. I bring 40 plus years of experience in the construction and engineering industry to this discussion today. And I look forward to visiting with you and hearing your questions at the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Like I said, we have a lot to cover. It's a hot topic, especially right now. So I'll let Alan go ahead and get us started here.
So I'm going to set the framework of the topic today by going through the basic legal requirements for condominium and homeowner associations relative to repair and maintenance, and they differ. The Condo Act has some very specific requirements, a little bit less than the Homeowner Association Act. For condos, 718.1131 Florida statutes, very clear statutory obligation to maintain and repair the common elements. And that's coupled with every declaration of condominium that I've seen has very specific requirements for maintenance and repair in the condo declarations themselves. For homeowners associations, the declarations of covenants and restrictions oblige homeowner associations to maintain association-owned property. In regard to multifamily buildings that are under the HOA regime, it really depends on the documents. One of the anomalies that really exist statewide is you have duplexes, triplexes, quads, sixplexes, and eightplexes governed by homeowners associations. And in many of them, under the documents, the homeowners association has very limited authority to maintain and repair, which is going to cause a problem many years down the road when there's going to need to be roof replacement and window replacement and wall repairs, structural repairs required for those particular types of buildings. And we make a strong recommendation for homeowners associations that have multifamily buildings within their properties to amend their documents to enhance the association's responsibility for maintenance and repair. Because I have never figured out how, for instance, two owners of a duplex can decide how and when to replace the roof over a duplex. Sometimes leakage may come in through one unit, let's say through a stucco crack, and the water actually gravitates to a different unit. How does that one owner who's getting wet force the other owner to make repairs? Those type of regimes in the long run aren't going to make sense. So that's something in multifamily buildings that has to be looked at under HOA control. As far as budgeting is concerned, again, the Condo Act requires that every board of directors overseeing condominiums every year produce a budget that has fully funded reserves based upon a designated formula for including lifespan and anticipated replacement cost. The issue in Florida is that that requirement can be waived by a vote of the owners attending a duly called meeting in which a quorum is present, which has allowed a lot of associations, condo associations around the state, not to have fully funded reserves. That waiver requirement may go by the wayside in the 2022 legislature. HOAs, there's no statute mandating reserves. The HOA documents vary considerably on what the reserve requirements are. The documents certainly can be amended to improve the reserve requirements. What happens when an association doesn't meet its repair and maintenance requirement? The important point first is that there's no self-help in the condo world or the homeowners association world. So if you live in a condo and the roof is leaking and you're getting water into your unit, you can't hire a roofer to replace that roof. You're restricted from that. You're totally reliant on the association. Same thing with a homeowners association. On any portion of the property that the homeowner association has responsibility for maintenance and repair, the owner can't act on their own. And in the Condo Act under 718-3031, if a condo association fails to undertake its maintenance and repair responsibility, a unit owner can get an injunction, a mandatory injunction to require repairs, and also damages as a result of the association's failure to undertake the repairs, plus attorney's fees. The same is true for homeowners associations under 720-3051. For the portions of the property that the homeowners association has an obligation to maintain and repair, association-owned property or buildings that they have by the documents, repair obligations. If the association fails to properly undertake that obligation, just like with a condo, a member of a homeowners association can go into circuit court, get an injunction and or damages, and get their attorney's fees. So there's some substantial repercussions under both statutes for the associations failing to act. The last point I'm going to bring about has to do with legislation and city county ordinances affecting condominiums, may affect multifamily homeowner association buildings, but primarily condos. In Dade-Broward County, there's already an ordinance that requires recertification after 40 years of the various systems of a building. It looks like the Florida legislature may act in 2022 to make that a statewide requirement. I don't know what size building they're going to require it of. And we don't know whether they're going to mirror what Dade-Broward did and make it a 40-year certification, or maybe 20 years, or maybe even as little as 10 years. But we'll see what the legislature does in 2022. In the meantime, there are cities and counties that are at least considering adopting ordinances similar to Dade and Broward County and are not waiting for the legislature to act on a statewide basis. So certainly check with your jurisdiction to see if there's any movement afoot to require engineering inspections at an earlier point in time. And you know, those certifications and you know, show up to have your say whether you agree or don't agree with it, or whether you think the time period should be different than your city or county is proposing. It's an opportunity to certainly have a say in that. So that is my portion, setting up the legal basis for what's next with what Tom's going to indicate about the engineering approach to these issues.
Perfect. So Tom, we'll let you go ahead and take the podium here.
All righty, thank you. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things that we think are very important to the success of your buildings. First of all, regular inspections, and those can be conducted by your property manager, your maintenance manager, if they're sufficiently qualified to do inspections, or you can bring an engineer in periodically to do regular inspections of the property. The kind of things you should be looking for, or they should be looking for, are water, rust stains, cracks in any structural elements, paint blistering indicating water intrusion behind the paint layer, any building joints that currently exist. Those can range from a stucco joint that begins to either delaminate or crack, then any other typical building joints, expansion joints, and things of that nature. And then a close look at sealants as well during that inspection process, because failure of the sealants are going to begin the water intrusion process, which begins the damage process and will help the building deteriorate over time. The second thing I'd like to talk about are reserve studies. We recommend to our clients that they perform a full reserve study every 5 years. And it's a fairly comprehensive look at all the different elements of your building from a structural standpoint, from different building elements, fire protection, generators, just a full range of things, even including the grounds around the property, irrigation systems, pavement systems, and so on. And then you can update those regularly as work gets performed, but at least 5 years. And we recommend that you have an engineer do the reserve study simply because they take a different look than accountants do. There's plenty of really well-qualified reserve specialists out there and accountants that do that work, but the engineers have a different eye for detail than accountants do. So consider that when you're considering a reserve study. And then the one thing that we sometimes forget in recovery from a storm is to do a complete assessment of the building. You really need to get out there and look at it in detail, because these storms can be punishing, even if they're not Category 5 hurricanes. High winds, wind-driven rain can really take a toll, and then any large or small missile impacts to the structure can also create problems. So we recommend that you do a post-storm assessment if you have a close call with a tropical system. So I'd put that on my to-do list as well. And then lastly, once you've completed your regular inspections and your reserve studies, you need to plan for and fund ongoing maintenance work. We recommend, for instance, that buildings in this part of Florida be repainted every 7 years. And as a part of that process, you have your stucco evaluated to make sure it's not delaminating or cracking. You don't have paint blisters, you don't have breaks in your sealants, so that the building can be well protected the way it was designed. And the important thing is that just because something costs a lot of money to do doesn't mean it opens the door for deferring that work. You really pay a double price, double dividend by delaying that work and allowing interior damage and just damage to concrete structural elements to accelerate. So the last bullet there is plan and fund your ongoing maintenance work. And that's all I have for now. I'll pass it on to Will.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. So that's a perfect segue, Tom. Thank you, because from the property management perspective, The two challenges that we see regularly in our firm is funding and involvement. And I'll start off with the funding side here. Tom just left off with this planning and funding, and I would address that in the short and long term sense. Short term meaning just how well do you fund your repairs and maintenance in your annual operating budget? Quite often, that's one of the first areas that we see boards attempting to claw back some money for redistributing into another bucket. Well, every time you do that, what is a small problem now, down the road, if it's deferred maintenance, will grow into a larger, much more expensive project. So think about the last time you saw a thin hairline stucco crack on the outside of your building, and someone said, well, it's not really that big, it can wait. And then later on, it became that area that Tom was describing where water intrusion has now been attacking your building for a number of years. It's working its way into concrete, and it's eventually going to show up and present itself as spalling or something else that will cost you a heck of a lot more money in the future to repair. As part of the short term in your operating budget, I would ask you to all think about, and I mean this for the associations, the quality of the people you hire and what their skill set is directly reflected in your budget. Quite often we have serious debates with our board members about what is the right level of salary for an individual. And sometimes those expectations do not align with the salary requirement. I've had a board president who once asked me for a maintenance supervisor who was HVAC certified, a licensed electrician, and a certified pool operator to boot. And he wanted that for a salary which he wasn't even going to get the HVAC portion of it for. So I would suggest that you have to have a deep discussion with your property manager and their firm about what is an appropriate funding based upon the needs of your particular situation. That's the short term. Long term clearly is a reflection on the reserves. And so Alan had commented about what the law requires an association to do. And I would tell you on that end, when you're planning, your reserves themselves are a plan. They list out what you're saving for. They give you a timeline. You reflect in that timeline the amount of money necessary and a means of getting there at the time that you expect to replace something. So you have a rudimentary plan to begin with. But I would further tell you that your planning in terms of executing on a project should not be something that happens in the next 30 days or 60 days, particularly if you are going to address significant capital improvements or repairs along the lines of where you may need the services of a guy like Tom to come in, help you properly understand what the scope of work is for your particular needs, to be able to create the necessary scope of work that makes sense to a general contractor who is going to analyze it, apply a price to it, and then whom you would eventually contract with. All of that can't happen in 30, 60 days. It usually takes a lot longer to develop everything. So always keep that in mind when you're looking at what you need to do and what the real impact is, not only in the money, but in terms of time. So on the reserve side, folks, Alan was talking about what the requirements are. The law does allow to waive or to do some partial funding. And I would tell you that one of the, I'll call it a strategic error I see boards do, is that they don't reserve enough. And there is a mentality that we can address it when it comes due. I would tell you that in our firm, we would recommend to our associations that everyone who currently lives in your property is consuming a piece of what is going to be replaced. So by example, everyone who lives in a condo right now is using a piece of the roof. They're using that portion of the lifespan. So why wouldn't they contribute to the replacement of it? Because that's probably the most fair way you can spread your cost across all of those who are responsible for the upkeep of the building. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what level am I going to reserve at? What's the age of my building? Obviously, as something that's older, it becomes more and more susceptible to failure, which means you have less and less time to set aside your money. And then special assessment, it's a dirty word in our business. No one likes to hear a special assessment is pending in their building. But if at that point in time, it's what you need to be able to get something replaced, the immediate assumption is that that item is being replaced because it's failed or it's near failure. And again, as Alan had pointed out, it is the responsibility of the association to upkeep the property. A special assessment can be a useful tool. The financing piece here, a firm like ours has a specialist set aside where they can help leverage relationships with banks to get our associations better deals on the financing terms. But it is one way of offsetting the cost of the individual owners to help spread some of that burden. On this piece about board members and unit owner involvement, I'll start off with the unit owners because all too often there is apathy within the communities. I've seen large scale communities, whether they're 3,000 homes or 700 units in a building, and you may only have 10 people who show up for a board meeting. And the board is continuously talking about an upcoming project and the associated cost. And eventually when that hits and the bill comes due, suddenly people are saying, I didn't know. But you have to participate. This is an active sport here. If you're going to be a member of the community and you're going to participate in the decisions with the board to give them your input as a homeowner. So please do so. And then if there are unit owners who happen to have particular skills that apply for this, by example, if there were an engineer to live in the building, I'm sure the board would appreciate the expertise to be able to have a higher level discussion when they do hire a professional firm like Tom's, that there is someone there who speaks the same professional language and understands what the different terms are. And then lastly, board meetings. You know, for the boards out there, I would tell you that your news, no matter how it is received, whether you think it's good news or bad news, it should be shared. There is always a call for transparency amongst boards with the unit owners of what did our engineer find when he did his initial analysis of our building? What do we think is going to be the extent of any kind of repairs that are going to be made? And so share that with your homeowners. You know, those reports, if you're going to follow the law, do become official records of the community, and by the law would be available to the homeowners at their request. But I would tell you, don't wait for the request. Share it with them because they would have a better understanding of what you are looking at as the board. And that shared experience will bring the community together when you do have to then get into making significant investments in your community or going through the painstaking efforts of some kind of construction project, particularly if you get into things like concrete repair where the noise is extensive throughout the building. It has to be communicated what's going on for what length of time, what will be the inconvenience to the homeowners. Okay, so with that, Shauna, we'll come back to you.
Okay, perfect. Well, a couple of things, you know, I've seen come in through questions and just things that I hear, you know, out and about when talking to boards is what do, and a few, you all might want to chime in on this. What do you say to the boards who go ahead and get, you know, the reserve studies done, get the inspections done, but then they decide, well, we don't agree with this, or we don't want to, you know, follow this. What's your guidance to those boards as far as, you know, how much they should, you know, ignore the guidance of those reserve studies or, you know, the timelines or things of that nature?
Well, I can chime in on that. You know, under sorry,
Feedback there.
yeah, my
I'm gonna take turn it off.
hold
I think
on.
you guys might need to mute one.
A little bit of an echo there.
Yeah. We're on the move with Alan.
Yeah, that's better.
There we go.
All right, under both 718 and 720, the board of directors has a fiduciary obligation to the owners. And that's all the owners. And since your obligation under the documents and under the statute is to maintain and repair, arguably, if the board falls short as far as properly funding repairs that are necessary and properly funding reserves, you're getting into a territory of breaching your fiduciary duty. Unfortunately, what you run into is the board tends to cater to the lowest common denominator from a financial standpoint. So you have a building, let's say maybe where there's some widows who are left with a loan without, proper financial planning. You have families that may not be able to afford large assessments. And you have people who, frankly, within a few years, they're either going to turn their unit over, or they're elderly and they're not going to be around that long, and they make the decision that, would rather not fund. And unfortunately, the fiduciary obligation is to meet the repair and maintenance obligation today, not to defer it. And if you're not prepared to do that, you probably shouldn't be on the board, frankly.
Yeah. And Sean, if I can add to that, we occasionally run into this with our boards, and we have to have some tough conversations, because when folks say, well, I don't believe that. And quite frankly, I have to question them and say, based upon what? Because you hired experts to provide you with an opinion. The extent of that opinion may not be very popular, particularly if it appears that it's going to cost you a lot of money, but you hired them for their expertise. And so if you have questions to that end, well, re-engage the individual that you hired to perhaps you want to question some of their assumption. I understand that, and that is perfectly legitimate in a normal business transaction. But to simply ignore it because you don't happen to like the price tag, I think you then start to run in a ground from where Alan was talking about, where you're now starting to neglect your duties.
Perfect. This one's probably geared more towards Tom. If there are no outward signs of cracked concrete, on a lanai or parts of the building, how do you tell if there's spalling occurring?
Well, the easiest way to deal with spalling is by sounding it out. We have specific tools that we use that they don't cause any damage. They roll over the surface, and you'll hear a difference in the bonding of stucco to the concrete structure. And that immediately tells you the size of it, the magnitude of it, and you can do more destructive work during the repair process to make sure that you chase out the full extent of any delamination of stucco or any spalling. So that's a great way to approach that. The other thing I'd like to, if I could jump back one question, is with regard to, if you don't like the engineer's opinion on something that needs to be repaired, seek a second opinion. We're not afraid of that, but ask somebody else to take a look at it if you're really that concerned about it. The other thing is, their engineer can be your advocate and can help you come up with alternative solutions to resolving any particular problem that develops on a building. So use that resource. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be intimidated by it, and work with the engineer to come up with the right solution.
Fantastic. Oops, sorry. Let's see here. So, and this is probably for all of you, really, you could chime in. Is it ever appropriate to defer maintenance? And, that can also be restated as, what type of maintenance can you, safely defer or consider deferring?
Sean, I would tell you that's a tough question. I think it's independent of each situation. So I would answer that question to any board member from their assessment of the risk, right? If we're talking about repainting the interior walls of the gym, probably a whole bunch of low risk involved with that if you defer it for a year, right? I mean, it won't be as aesthetically pleasing. But if you're talking about the waterproofing of a deck or planters, which may have impact to a garage below, I would say now you're getting into high risk if you decide to defer that. So each case should be weighed independently. And if there are, if you are getting into some tough questions, it's probably at the point where it's more of a complex problem and you should bring in your professionals.
And if I could speak to that as well, there's a reason why we suggest 5-year cycles on reserve studies. If you have a waterproofing membrane that's got a 20-year life expectation on it, or even a 20-year warranty on it, and you're looking at it every 5 years, you might get 22 years out of it. Or what we typically propose is 7-year cycles for the paint cycles. But if a board decides, something's going on that's not going to allow it to happen in year 7, it'll happen in year 8. Or we have other boards that go on a 10-year cycle, but they're willing to pay a little extra for the paint project to get a higher quality paint that's going to give them a longer life. So there are alternatives. That's why I say, don't be afraid to talk to your engineer about what other options do I have.
Great, thank you. And gentlemen, we were kind of chatting a bit yesterday about, what we're hearing on the streets, or what you guys are hearing on the streets, right now with changes, due to recent circumstances. So one of the questions that came in is, do you guys think the state will begin to require local county inspectors trained properly compared to what they have now? Have you heard anything? I know obviously we don't have a magic ball that we can look at. We don't know for sure, but have you heard anything in regard to that?
I think there's a misnomer about the role of building departments for existing buildings. The primary function of building departments is to assure upon initial construction that, not to assure, but to create a better opportunity for buildings to comply with the building codes in new construction activities. When a repair project comes up that requires permitting, it's obviously also the municipalities, the county's obligation to come in and review the plans and inspect that work. But there's no requirement right now that any city or county, the example may be like the police force. The police force does send cars out on patrol. You might see them riding through their neighborhood because they are charged with making regular patrols to see if there's any issue that they need to react to. The same is not the case for city and county building departments. They don't have the staff that are capable of doing that and doing any kind of periodic inspections. They respond to new requests for work on buildings. And if an engineer like Tom sees a building that's at risk of structural collapse and he drops a engineering report on the building official's desk, then yes, the building official does have a requirement to act. But what I think you're going to see from the legislature is a requirement on the part of the owner, condo associations primarily, to hire their own engineer to conduct the inspection and potentially provide that report for approval as to adequacy by the city or county building department. But I don't think you're going to see a requirement that the city and counties actually have engineers on staff who are going to be doing any type of periodic inspections. Most building departments do not have engineers on staff, at least when it comes to building. You may see engineers like in their utilities departments and so forth, but it's a lot less common for there to be professional engineers from a building standpoint sitting as part of the staff of building departments. I hope that answers.
And Shauna, along those lines, I have seen 2 local governments where they've put out a letter to the community. But to Alan's point, they put the onus on the association to hire someone. And that came out from both Miami and then more recently the town of Palm Beach. But each time it directed the association to hire someone to have an inspection/analysis done at their particular property.
Now, there was a circumstance that actually occurred in Sarasota where there was a failure of a 4th floor transfer slab that closed a high-rise building down. And what the city of Sarasota did was not only require that the association hire its own engineers to determine what needed to be done in order to correct the problem, but the city actually retained a separate engineering firm with taxpayer money to also study the building, to act as really an information source for the city in order to approve eventually the repair that was undertaken. So that's certainly an option that a city or a county can do, which is hire an engineering firm, not necessarily to dictate what needs to be done, but to give the city or county an information source by which it can make some very difficult decisions about what to approve as far as repairs that are done.
Anything else to add to that, gentlemen, before we move on? Good. Okay. So what advice do you have for, I'm going to give an example that somebody gave. So, you know, an association is getting bids on a project that they're planning for. So in this case, a new MAR site for the pool. And then they find out, because as we know, there's a lot of aging buildings in Florida. So codes and things have changed. So, you know, as they're going through this, they find out they need other new things, like new non-slip tile that's required by law. How do you kind of plan for those things? So as we're planning, how do we plan for those new things that might be required that weren't originally kind of in the scope of work that they thought about?
Tom, do you want to start that or you want me?
No, I'll start that off. Well, you have to rely on the engineer's experience across a pretty wide spectrum of disciplines. I just recently completed a generator replacement project that had those type of implications on it. The electrical code had changed. The fire code had changed, both impacting the way the generator and the automatic transfer switch were going to be wired in the building. And then the air intake for the generator room was designed in the early 80s. And so it wasn't up to hurricane standards. So it had to be replaced to meet the current hurricane code. So the ramifications are significant, but you need to have an engineer sufficiently experienced across disciplines that they may not be an electrical engineer, but they can read the electrical code and say, oh yeah, well, this now requires this kind of a connection. Before the fire pump was wired remotely to its own automatic transfer switch. Now the automatic transfer switch is incorporated into the controller for the fire pump. So all of those things need to be considered when you are taking on some of these replacement projects. And I say, just rely on the expertise of your engineer, of your property manager, because we've seen it before. It happens on a regular basis up and down the coast as you get into some of these condominiums.
The example of that Sarasota project, what the building department required, the main problem was this transfer slab that had failed at the 4th floor. But what the city required was that the outside walls of the building now be brought up to the current hurricane codes. And a large portion of the eventual repair cost was actually to bolster the exterior walls of this, again, high rise that had been built 35 years earlier. And so the cities and counties do have the right to require upgrades to meet building codes, and in that case, even outside where the central structural problem was. And again, it certainly affects window replacement, because you need to get your windows replaced. You find out the price tag of now having to get windows that can withstand hurricane force winds. It greatly exceeds the cost. If in fact you're not waiting 2 years for your windows to be delivered, which is a major supply chain problem right now.
Yeah, Sean, I would talk to that board in that regard, and make sure they understand that when an initial inspection was done of whatever the issue is, and I'm gonna go back to this example of concrete restoration. So if you get a report back and it's being qualified up front by that it was my assessment's based upon a visual inspection versus destructive testing. there's a huge difference in there. And Tom would tell you that, on the visual inspection, you're looking at the exterior of a building, you're looking for signs of what's wrong, and that's the extent of it, versus if you start actually getting into certain spots and peeling back some stucco to see what's happening, which would then give you a deeper understanding of what you have going on. So that's a very significant piece that a board should understand. And then lastly, on this piece about, so what do I do for planning purposes? And within a project budget, I would always advise a board that they should have a contingency amount, particularly if you get into something like concrete restoration, because it's not exact. And the example I use there is if, you talk about a regular wall in your home and it's drywall and studs. And if you punch that wall and you say, now what's wrong with this? And someone would tell you that, well, you've got to repair that space there where it's been punched and it's dented in. But once you cut that out, and now you can see behind that wall and you can see what the studs look like, and you can see the wall that the studs are attached to, and perhaps there's some additional damage there. Well, you would never know that until you did some destructive work and did that initial cutout. And now all of a sudden you find out you have additional work to do. So a contingency can be your additional funding that's there to address the unknown. For when it does pop up, it's not such a surprise, and you do have the financial ability to address it.
And Will, if you don't mind, if I add to that from an operations and property management standpoint, is especially for some of the I say smaller, but we're talking about the pool, remar site, things of that nature. If you kind of know, you foresee those projects coming down the pike in the next couple of years, use your resources, use your experts for things like benchmarking and asking around. So for example, at Castle, when we know associations have big projects coming up, we're going to talk to other associations to the, what have they done? How much did it cost? What did they run into? Because those are things where we can use those prior, that prior history and experience to, help our other associations going forward on those planning expenses as well.
As a construction lawyer, I've been through several projects, and the issue of cost obviously is a major consideration. And as a general rule, where owners get hurt are primarily with allowance items and change orders during the course of a project. And I'm a big proponent for maximizing within reason the amount of destructive examination that you do before a job is let, so that as best as possible what the job is going to ultimately entail, and you're not discovering what's wrong during the course of a project, because you have a general contractor who's 3 months into the project, something gets revealed, and now the project's got to stop. There may need to be some design work done at that juncture, and significant costs are building up, and then you're getting a change order for the change. And the question would be is, if you had sent your engineer out before the job started, maybe cut some cores or remove some areas to get a look behind the curtain, so to speak, would you have been able to anticipate the quantities and the scope of the work before the contract was let? Because discovering it after the fact will guarantee a really great expansion of the costs. So I think what groups do sometimes is that they tend to want to save money on the investigation side. And when your engineers are being asked to detail a job and they've only been able to do a visual inspection of something that has a fair likelihood of having some surprises behind it, the engineer can only anticipate, can put in the plans allowance items in case something's discovered. There may be an allowance. So I'm a big proponent in learning as much about the problem as is possible before you finalize a contract with the general contractor.
Fantastic. How does an association determine that some items need repair or replacement sooner than estimated useful life in the reserve study?
Well, typically, the items in the reserve study have a range on their useful life. An air conditioning unit, 12 to 14 years, by example. But we've seen them fail at 8 to 10 years. So it depends. And it's really difficult. So that's why, to follow Will's advice, to have a contingency in the budget to say, okay, well, we're fully funded on that 2 years from now, but we're not going to turn the air conditioning off for 2 years. We move it up and then we start the cycle on that one unit again on a 12 to 14 year cycle. So these things are going to happen, but at the same time, you're going to have elements that are, if you're doing your 5-year reserve studies, you're going to find, oh, the useful life on this, we're going to exceed 15 years on this. We're going to be able to make it to 20. And you'll know that if you're looking at those items on a regular basis.
Yeah, and that's the piece I would highlight, Shauna. Look at it on a regular basis. You're gonna know whether or not it's failing. And the other piece, this goes back to Tom's earlier comment about the impact of hurricanes. Hurricanes apply unique forces to everything that they touch. And so if you don't do a thorough inspection post-hurricane to see that, because by the way, unfortunately, you may have a brand new piece of equipment, you go through a significant hurricane, and guess what? Its useful life just dropped by a significant amount of time if it's not outright damaged. So look at your equipment on a regular basis, and you will see signs of what's happening there. And then I go back to my comment about hire the right people. Anybody who's involved in your maintenance world should know what right looks, smells, or feels like on other pieces of equipment.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let's see. Speaking of hurricanes, let's talk about wind for a second. Wind mitigation. Do you need a certificate in a certain time interval?
I'll take that. I mean, the insurance companies typically look for wind calculations for buildings. And so I think that's on a 3-year cycle. I'd have to check it. But you can have an engineer come out and take a look, document it, photograph it, fill out their wind mitigation forms and submit it. So yeah, wind mitigation is definitely something that you need to consider.
Okay, thank you. Are internal water systems recommended to be part of a reserve study? Does treated fresh water when leaking pose a structural danger as well?
The answer to that is yes. Water is our friend and it's our enemy. So leaking, whether it's from your fire detection system or your potable system, it doesn't matter. Water is a problem. And in particularly in high-rise condominiums, it's a much bigger issue to understand than just a single-family home or a 2-story condominium. The reason being is you have pressure boosters within that system, and then within units you have pressure reducers. You have all sorts of things that you're doing to tweak and control the pressure for every single unit owner in a high-rise building. And so that takes special equipment, special devices unique to every single unit. So you have to be on top of that. You have to understand how that all works together. Booster pumps for your domestic water system, those things have to be working, and that's something you're going to have a failure. You can't shut down the water to the building. So those have to be repaired quickly, and they should be part of that reserve study and any contingencies if you're concerned about an early failure.
Yeah, Shauna, during my time as a developer, water was the single biggest concern we had when we were designing a building once it was built. And it doesn't matter if it's, as Tom said, it doesn't matter if it's potable or non-potable water, it still has the same corrosive effect. And then don't forget, in the short term, the immediate threat is mold. So wherever it presents itself and what it can get to, you're going to have that mold issue first, and then long term, you're going to have the destructive nature of water. I mean, it sounds silly, but everybody always talks about how the entire Grand Canyon was cut by that one little river over time. So while it's clearly not cutting a Grand Canyon through your building, it is causing cracks and rusting problems and other related issues. So the only proper place for water is where it's supposed to be, within a pipe.
Absolutely.
Cast iron pipe deterioration is a big issue in older buildings. And I know the engineers grapple with the cost of replacing the system, which in a high-rise building is extremely expensive with the finishes that have to be disrupted. Unit occupancy sometimes needs to be abated. Then you have a lot of companies on the market who want to sell associations lining for cast iron piping. And there's then an issue about how long the linings are going to last, whether every system is conducive for that type of repair. Tom, do you have any chime in on where you folks go when a group's has cast iron pipe deterioration, about when to line, when it can't be lined, and so forth?
Sure. And I've just recently completed a fairly large pipelining project. And what I would suggest to property managers and associations and board members is that when you know you have a cast iron pipe system that's beginning to fail, address it early. The longer you wait, the worse the failure gets, and the more likely you're not going to be able to do a lining project. So in other words, you eliminate one option and you may be forced into a pipe replacement project in lieu of line versus pipe replacement. So address it early, acknowledge it early, and see if lining is an option for you.
And Will, I think that's somebody asked a question about deferred maintenance, and that creates an excellent point, which is you defer acting on an issue like that, and the ultimate repair, when you compare cast iron pipe replacement to a lining job, I mean, it's many multiple costs, aggravation, and risk compared to doing the lining job.
Yeah,
But,
and Tom's point about addressing that early, you think about what are the collateral effects of it, right? And so if one of those cast iron pipes suddenly has a large failure, now it's you think about the damage it causes when all that water is going through a unit or multiple units, which is typically the case in the high-rise scenario, versus if you did the pipelining piece, you have bought yourself some time, and you did exercise that option. And then when the association starts thinking about their finances, if you've pipelined, you've actually given yourself some time to extend the cash flow argument there of how much I can save, how much I can spend, et cetera, over a certain amount of time without there being the looming catastrophe from it going unaddressed.
Thank you. So we talk about, these reserve studies and properly funding. So we have, a condo association who's, funding their reserves. They have, a fixed amount that goes in every month. But they just had a recent reserve study and they determined that they're actually, underfunded. So do you guys have any advice, suggestions on, how to catch up their reserves or, what to do in those type of circumstances?
Well, we do. When we do a reserve study and we find that a reserve account is underfunded, and there's a great example I'll use. When Hurricane Irma came through, the price of roofing doubled. And so all of a sudden, everybody's reserve funding for their roof replacement projects was underfunded. Well, we didn't expect that peak to last for 20 years, but it's certainly something that couldn't be ignored. And so we made associations aware of the impacts of that price increase. And so I think associations need to weigh those sort of things and say, well, geez, ours isn't due for replacement in 10 years. Do we really need to fund it to this extremely high level, or can we get there gradually over time? And so we identified very specifically by line item and by total assessment on an annual basis on where we think they ought to be for individual items. And typically they balance out across the entire reserve study so that roofing isn't just going to kill the entire reserve study, but we recognize those changes from year to year or over a cycle. We recently saw a substantial increase in elevator replacement cost. So we've incorporated those into reserve studies going forward. And we keep a database of pricing for all of these systems that we update every time we do a reserve study to make sure that we're current on our pricing and that we're reflecting accurate pricing in the market today.
Perfect. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
No, that's a good answer.
Okay. This one's probably one for Alan. We have a few more minutes here, so we'll try to cover a couple more. Is there any recourse if the building department approved work on your building to bring it up to code, and then it's found out later that it was actually incorrect and it was not brought up to appropriate code?
Simple answer, no. In the case I was personally involved in that I argued before the Florida Supreme Court way back in 1985, Trianon Park versus City of Hialeah, made it very clear in Florida that there's no liability on the part of building departments for their building inspections. And I think under that scenario, if they mandated a certain repair and it ended up not doing the job and there was more work required, I don't think the city would have liability.
Okay,
Shauna, if I could add to that,
please
I
do.
think we have a good example of how something like that gets handled when you look back on the failure of those Hyatt walkways back in the 80s, killed a number of people. Florida adopted a threshold building inspection program where building developers had to hire a threshold inspector to ensure that the construction was completed in accordance with the design in terms of reinforcing steel and concrete strength and so on. And so nowadays, when there are building renovations and modifications done, a threshold inspector has to sign off on the quality of the work and the extent of the work when that is completed. And they submit that to the city or the county building official.
Okay, thank you. We don't see a lot of this in Florida, thanks to our hurricanes and needing to be able to withstand wind, but do you have any idea if there is a suggested timeline for structural inspections for wooden structures, wooden buildings or structures?
Tom, has the code addressed that? I'm not aware of anything on the wooden side.
No, I can't think of anything in particular. The main changes to the building code over the past decades or so have been the strength of the walls and the waterproofing on the exterior of the buildings for wood frame construction. But I'm not aware of any standard for wood frame construction.
Yeah, the other thing about that, Shauna, is wood frame construction is typically limited to 2 stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, well, we have about a minute left here, gentlemen. Do you guys kind of want to have any kind of closing words? And I would like to just remind everybody, we will send out the video recording. We'll send out everybody's contact information who's here on our panel. And if you did not get your question addressed, please feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll try to address that. It's hard to get to all of them during the time frame. But gentlemen, I'll let you guys take it away.
My closing point is that the board's got to recognize its fiduciary obligation and its maintenance and repair obligation together, and be courageous, communicate well with their owners, and make the difficult decisions that are necessary in order to meet the requirements of the statute and the documents as far as repairs are concerned.
Tom?
I guess my only closing comment would be that I agree with that suggestion. Grab onto your fiduciary responsibility and don't shy away. It's an important role when you become a board member, and you need to fulfill it completely.
Yeah. My main takeaway would be hire the right people. I like the term that Tom used before, where he said people who are sufficiently qualified to do a particular job, and that goes at all tiers, whether you're talking about your local on-site property management team or it's experts like Tom and Alan who are on this call today. That it's those folks who are going to guide you, particularly in areas where you're not the expert. So don't try to be. Hire the right folks, let them guide you. Question them. We're not saying that you have to take everything carte blanche, but I think the more that you get involved in that discussion, that the more you'll have a greater understanding and a better outcome.
Well, gentlemen, thank you all so much for your time today. We appreciate it. I've already had some people type in that they appreciate it as well. We thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
gentlemen.
right.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for your
everyone.
opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you.